Beneath the streets of modern Phoenix lies the shadow of another city, an ancient world shaped not by towers or roads, but by hundreds of miles of canals carved through the Sonoran Desert. Without metal tools, engines, or modern surveying equipment, these builders redirected unpredictable rivers and transformed barren ground into thriving farmland. But when floods, drought, and social pressure struck, their vast water network began to unravel. Before we follow the buried canals into this forgotten world, please like the video and subscribe for more mysteries from the ancient past. Beneath the traffic lights, airport runways, parking garages, and endless straight roads of modern Phoenix lies another city, one that does not appear on ordinary maps. Its streets are not streets at all. They are broad, shallow scars cut into the earth, some running for miles beneath the neighborhoods, warehouses, golf courses, and concrete drainage channels. Most are invisible from the surface. A person can cross one on the way to work or live for decades beside its buried edge without knowing that water once moved there. When construction crews open the ground, however, the older landscape sometimes returns. Layers of pale sediment curve through darker soil. Parallel banks emerge where no modern ditch was planned. Pottery fragments, stone tools, hearths, and the stains of vanished houses appear nearby. The pattern is unmistakable, long before Phoenix became a modern metropolis. Another vast settlement system occupied the Salt River Valley, and its survival depended on one of the most ambitious irrigation networks ever created in ancient North America. The people who built it are often called the Hohokam, an archaeological name applied to a cultural tradition that developed across central and southern Arizona. Many museums and researchers now also use the phrase ancestral Sonoran desert people, while Hohokam communities preserve living histories that connect them to those who farmed these valleys before European colonization. The terminology matters because these remains belong to an indigenous landscape whose descendants remain present. Even so, the scale of what lies beneath Phoenix is difficult to absorb. Archaeologists have documented prehistoric villages, canals, and related sites across the city, with occupations extending roughly from the beginning of the first millennium into the 15th century. At Sedavvaiki, a surviving archaeological site within Phoenix, visitors can still see traces of irrigation works beside a platform mound and a ball court. But these exposed remains are only fragments of a much larger system now buried by the modern city. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and a mystery you enjoy, because the mystery here is not that ancient people somehow discovered water in a desert. The Salt River was never truly hidden. It flowed through the valley, sometimes broad and forceful, sometimes reduced, sometimes violent enough to tear apart its own banks. The deeper mystery is how communities without metal machinery, powered pumps, aerial surveys, or written engineering manuals learned to divert that unstable river into canals laid across nearly level ground. They had to know where water would enter, how quickly it would move, where sediment would gather, and how one village's demand would affect another downstream. A canal that was slightly too steep could erode itself into a ravine. One that was too flat could choke with silt. A diversion placed badly could fail during low water or be destroyed during a flood. The builders had to solve all of these problems repeatedly, not once, but across generations. From the air, before urban growth concealed so much of the valley floor, the old canal routes could sometimes be followed as long bands crossing the desert terraces. On the ground, early settlers saw portions of them as abandoned trenches, proof that the apparently empty valley had supported an earlier agricultural world. In the late 19th century, newcomers reopened and reused some ancient alignments, recognizing that the old builders had already located efficient paths through the land. Phoenix itself was named partly through the idea of a new settlement rising from an older one. Although the romantic image of a dead civilization giving way to a modern city hides an uncomfortable truth, the modern city expanded across indigenous land, borrowed ancient engineering logic, and covered much of the archaeological record beneath roads and buildings. The modern water system also has roots in routes first tested by ancient canal makers, though dams, pumps, and concrete have transformed its scale. The National Park Service notes that 19th century irrigation development in the valley made direct use of abandoned canal landscapes, while later federal projects built upon both ancient and pioneer networks. NOSAAMSGov, HTTP, WSW, NPSAS Gov, Articles, Arizona Roosevelt, Dam and Power Plant, HGEM UTM, Source, ChatGPT.com. What survives in the record suggests not a single canal but a layered landscape of canals built, abandoned, redirected, enlarged, and recut over centuries. A channel visible in an excavation may contain several earlier channels beneath or beside it, each marking an attempt to improve flow or recover from damage. The Earth remembers these decisions as bands of sediment. Flood deposits may seal an older ditch. A newer canal may slice through it at a slightly different angle. The remains can look modest when exposed in a trench, but they belong to systems that once carried river water outward toward fields and settlements, far from the active channel. Along the Salt and Gila rivers, irrigation allowed communities to occupy land that rainfall alone could never have farmed reliably. The result was not a small oasis surrounded by empty desert. It was a densely used human landscape where villages, fields, gathering areas, paths, and canals formed an interconnected region. The city of Phoenix describes these works as among the largest and most sophisticated canal systems in the pre-European New World, a claim that reflects both their extent and the social coordination required to keep them functioning. SSS Gov HTTPS DSS SSS Gov Articles Hohokam Culture HTM UTM Source ChatGPT.com. The canals are easy to admire as feats of geometry, but their deeper achievement was continuity. Digging the first channel was only the beginning. Every season brought sediment, roots, burrowing animals, and floods capable of destroying a diversion in hours. A functioning system demanded observation, memory, and labour shared across households. Someone had to notice when water slowed. Someone had to organise the clearing of a blocked reach. Someone had to decide when a branch channel opened and how long a field received water. These decisions are almost entirely absent from surviving evidence. No tablets list water allotments, and no canal master left a personal account. Archaeologists must infer social organisation from channel dimensions, settlement patterns, construction episodes, and the relationships between villages. Scholars still debate how authority worked, how disputes were settled, and whether control remained broadly communal or became concentrated in particular places and households. That uncertainty gives the buried network much of its power. The canals are enormous, yet the people who plan them rarely appear as individuals. Their fingerprints survive indirectly in the slope of a channel, in the careful placement of a headgate area, in the widening of a main canal, and in the repeated return to a route that had already proven useful. The builders understood the valley not as a blank desert, but as a surface filled with subtle differences. A rise almost too gentle to see could determine whether water reached a field. A bend in the river could offer a diversion point for a generation, and then become useless after a flood shifted the channel. Soil that looked dry and barren could become productive if wetted at the right time. Yet the same ground could accumulate salts if drainage failed. The engineering was inseparable from intimate environmental knowledge. Modern Phoenix makes that ancient perception difficult to recover. Asphalt survey grids and buildings conceal old terraces, while the river has been reshaped by dams, diversions, and flood control works. Yet whenever archaeology exposes one of the old canals, the modern map seems to become transparent for a moment. Beneath it is another map, drawn not with property lines but with gravity. It follows the fall of the land by fractions, carrying water away from the river without letting it escape too quickly. It connects places that modern residents may think of as separate suburbs but that once belonged to the same hydraulic world. There is a temptation to measure this achievement by how closely it resembles modern technology, but the canals do not need that comparison. They were successful on their own terms for many centuries, built with tools and institutions suited to their society. Their makers did not conquer the desert in any permanent sense. No one does. They entered into a demanding arrangement with a river that could nourish them, betray them, or change course without warning. The system expanded because generations learned from earlier channels, preserved practical knowledge, and committed labour to works whose benefits reached beyond a single household. It also remained vulnerable because every enlargement increased the number of people tied to the same uncertain flow. The first clue, then, is not merely that canals exist beneath Phoenix. It is that an entire urban region has been built over the remains of another kind of city, one whose central architecture was moving water. Houses could be rebuilt, fields could shift, ceremonial places could rise and fall. But the canals bound the landscape together, tracing the collective decisions of people who made one of North America's harshest environments support large and enduring communities. Their outlines still run below the modern metropolis like a second circulation system, dry now in many places, broken into fragments, but not erased. To understand how that hidden city became possible, the concrete and asphalt must be stripped away in the imagination until the valley is open again, the river is undammed, and the desert reveals the dangerous abundance that made canal building necessary. The valley before modern dams is not a silent bowl of sand. It is a place of violent contrasts, where water is scarce for long stretches and then suddenly appears with enough force to rearrange the land. The Salt River descends from mountain country to the northeast, carrying snowmelt, storm runoff, branches, gravel, and enormous loads of sediment into the open desert basin. Farther south, the Gila gathers water from an even larger region. Between them lies a broad lowland framed by rugged mountains, under a sky capable of remaining cloudless for weeks before erupting into summer storms. To people arriving without deep knowledge of this landscape, the desert might appear hostile to agriculture. To communities who learn its rhythms, it offers something more complicated: danger, uncertainty, and extraordinary fertility concentrated along the rivers. The soil of these valleys is built by water. Floods spread fine silts across low terraces, renewing the ground with minerals carried from distant uplands. Where moisture can be delivered at the proper season, crops grow vigorously, but rainfall alone cannot be trusted. Phoenix today receives little annual precipitation, and much of it arrives unevenly. A storm may soak one slope while leaving another nearly untouched. Winter rain can fail. Summer monsoon clouds may gather with theatrical promise, and then pass without releasing more than dust-cooled wind. A family relying entirely on local rain would face years when fields germinated poorly or not at all. The rivers offer a more dependable source, but dependable does not mean gentle. In spring, snow melting in the mountains can raise the Salt River gradually, giving farmers time to prepare fields and diversions. At other moments, storms upstream send sudden surges into the valley. The water becomes thick and brown, carrying whole trees and grinding stones against one another beneath the surface. Riverbanks collapse, sandbars vanish, channels divide and reunite. A diversion structure carefully repaired over many days can disappear in a single night. The flood does not merely overflow a fixed riverbed, it may create a new one. That instability becomes one of the central facts of life for the canal communities. They cannot simply build beside the river and assume the river will remain beside them. The desert adds another kind of pressure. Summer heat is not a dramatic event that passes quickly. It settles over the valley for months. Day after day, the ground radiates heat, shade contracts beneath walls, and exposed water disappears into the air. Irrigation channels lose part of their flow before it ever reaches a field. Crops must be planted and watered according to careful schedules, because too little moisture kills them while too much can damage roots or leave salts behind as the water evaporates. The builders are not merely bringing water to dry soil, they are balancing an entire chain of risks from river intake to harvest. This is why the idea of the desert as empty or lifeless becomes misleading. The Sonoran Desert contains remarkable biological abundance, but its abundance is distributed according to season, elevation, and access to water. Mesquite grows along washes and floodplains, providing wood, shade, and edible pods. Saguaro fruit ripens in early summer, offering food just before the monsoon season. Agave, cholla buds, wild greens, seeds, and small animals supplement cultivated crops. Cottonwood and willow mark wetter ground. These resources matter because canal agriculture never exists in isolation. Farming households move through a larger landscape of gathering, hunting, exchange, and ritual knowledge. The fields provide stability, but the desert continues to feed them in ways that canals cannot replace. A lesser-known feature of the valley is how little slope is visible to the human eye. The land seems almost flat, yet it descends gradually away from the rivers. That slight fall makes irrigation possible. Water can move for miles without pumps if a canal follows the correct contour. The opportunity is enormous, but so is the margin for error. A channel cut at the wrong angle may lose too much elevation early and become useless farther away. A route that appears direct may cross ground too high for the water to climb. The people who eventually create the great canal systems must learn to read differences in elevation that modern surveyors measure with instruments. They do so through repeated observation, trial, and inherited knowledge. The valley also contains natural channels, abandoned river courses, and seasonal washes that can confuse or assist canal planning. Some routes may be adapted from older drainage lines. Others must cross them, risking damage whenever stormwater rushes down from nearby mountains. Farmers therefore confront two water systems at once: the controlled flow they try to guide from the river, and the uncontrolled runoff that descends from the desert around them. One sustains the fields. The other can bury a canal under gravel or cut through its banks. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that these environmental challenges did not produce a single moment of invention. Canal irrigation develops gradually. Small channels teach lessons that larger ones later incorporate. A community learns where sediment settles, which soils absorb too much water, and which diversion points survive seasonal changes. Failure becomes part of the engineering tradition. Every collapsed bank and abandoned channel leaves information for those who rebuild. Scholars still debate exactly how climate shifts affected different periods of growth and contraction, because the evidence remains incomplete and local conditions varied. Tree ring records, flood deposits, pollen, river sediments, and settlement patterns offer clues, but none provides a perfect year-by-year account for every village. What is clear is that the people of the Salt and Gila valleys never inhabit a stable environment. Their success comes from managing instability rather than escaping it. The same floods that destroy a canal also renew fields. The same heat that threatens crops allows long growing seasons. The same rivers that wander unpredictably create the fertile basin that makes large-scale farming worthwhile. This contradiction lies at the heart of the canal world. The desert does not simply resist settlement, nor does the river simply rescue it. Together they create a landscape rich enough to support thousands of people. But only if those people organize themselves around uncertainty. Long before the largest canals appear, families living along these waterways begin learning that survival depends on more than finding water. It depends on anticipating its movement, sharing its labor, and remembering what the land did in earlier seasons. The first farmers do not yet command the vast networks that will later cross the valley, but they are already studying the forces that will shape everything to come. The first farmers of the Sonoran Desert do not begin with canals wide enough to resemble artificial rivers. Their earliest experiments are smaller, closer to the natural floodplain, and far less permanent. They plant where seasonal water has softened the soil, along low terraces and near washes that briefly carry runoff after storms. They watch which patches retain moisture, which crops survive the heat, and which riverbanks are likely to be renewed rather than stripped away. Over generations. These observations become a form of engineering knowledge, though it is not separated from daily life. Farming, gathering, house building, seasonal movement, and the reading of clouds all belong to the same practical understanding of the valley. Agriculture had already travelled into the southwest from regions farther south, bringing crops first domesticated in Mesoamerica. Maize becomes especially important, but its earliest forms are not identical to the large cobs familiar today. They are smaller and require careful cultivation. Squash contributes edible flesh, seeds, and durable containers. Beans arrive later and help create a more nutritionally balanced farming system. Cotton, eventually grown in significant quantities, becomes both a practical crop and a valuable material for exchange. None of these plants removes the need for wild foods. Mesquite pods, cactus fruits, agave, seeds, game, and river resources remain essential, especially when cultivated fields fail. The people archaeologists later group within the Hohokam tradition emerge from this long local history rather than appearing suddenly as a fully formed canal civilization. The name has often been treated as though it describes a single nation with fixed borders. But archaeology reveals considerable variation across time and place. Villages differ in size, architecture, pottery, ritual features, and access to water. Communities along the major rivers experience the desert differently from those living beside smaller streams or in upland zones. What links them is not one uniform way of life, but a changing collection of practices, relationships, technologies, and artistic traditions that develop across centuries. Early houses are often built partly below ground, creating floors insulated from the worst extremes of heat and cold. Wooden posts support roofs of brush and earth. Around them lie storage pits, work areas, cooking places, and open spaces where households carry out daily tasks. These settlements may look modest compared with the large villages that later dominate the river valleys, yet they contain the beginnings of a more organized agricultural landscape. Fields must be planted at the correct moment, seed must be saved, food must be stored against lean seasons, water must be shared, whether it comes from floodwater, runoff, shallow channels, or small diversions. The earliest irrigation works probably exploit opportunities close to the rivers. A short ditch can carry water from a favourable bend toward nearby soil. A low earthen barrier can redirect part of a seasonal flow without attempting to restrain the whole river. These works are vulnerable, but their small scale also makes them easier to replace. When a flood erases one, the community can cut another. Every attempt teaches something about gradient, soil, and timing. The knowledge is accumulated not in diagrams but in repeated practice: how water behaves when a channel narrows, how quickly a bank dries and cracks, and how much sediment settles after a muddy flow. One surprising clue to this gradual development is that canals can preserve evidence of their own ancestry. Archaeologists sometimes find multiple channels crossing or overlapping one another, with older ditches buried beneath later enlargements. A modest early canal may be abandoned when the river shifts, then replaced by a deeper route nearby. In other places, generations recut nearly the same alignment, suggesting that certain paths through the valley remained valuable for centuries. The final large system therefore represents many episodes of experimentation rather than a single inspired design. This slow process also changes society. A household can maintain a tiny field channel, but even a moderately long canal requires cooperation beyond one family. People must agree where to place the intake, whose fields receive water first, and when repairs are necessary, a break in the bank upstream can affect everyone below it. The technology begins creating obligations between households that might otherwise have remained more independent. Shared water encourages larger and more stable communities, while larger communities make more ambitious waterworks possible. Each development strengthens the other. Yet it would be misleading to imagine a smooth march from primitive ditches toward inevitable complexity. Some communities continue using rainfall, runoff farming, and small irrigation systems even as large canals expand elsewhere. Local conditions determine what is useful. A broad river terrace may justify enormous communal labour, while a smaller valley may reward flexible fields that can be moved after floods. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact dates and sequences of some early canals because later construction often destroyed or buried earlier traces. Environmental knowledge also includes the recognition that farming can damage the ground it depends upon. Repeated irrigation may raise salts toward the surface as water evaporates. Sediment can improve a field in one place while smothering it in another. Crops draw nutrients from the soil, and pests can spread through concentrated plantings. Farmers respond by shifting plots, adjusting flows, allowing areas to rest, and combining cultivated foods with the desert's wild harvests. Their success does not come from imposing a rigid system on the land, but from maintaining several ways to survive at once. By the early centuries of the first millennium, this accumulated knowledge is beginning to alter the scale of settlement in the Salt and Gila valleys. Villages become more closely tied to irrigation routes. Pottery production expands, making storage and cooking more efficient. Exchange carries marine shell inland from the Gulf of California and moves stone, pigments, food, and crafted goods between communities. The river valleys are becoming not merely places where people happen to farm, but organized landscapes whose fields and settlements depend on shared channels. The great canals still lie ahead. Their construction will demand a level of planning and labor that these early farmers may not yet imagine. But the essential discoveries have already been made. Water can be persuaded to leave the river. Desert soil can produce reliable harvests. Families can bind their futures together through a channel that none could maintain alone. From these small cuts in the floodplain, an entire canal world begins to take shape. Once communities begin extending canals beyond the immediate floodplain, the problem changes. It is no longer enough to cut a ditch from the river toward a nearby field. Water must be guided across long distances through land that appears almost perfectly flat, yet is not flat at all. The valley tilts so gradually that the difference may be invisible to anyone standing on the ground. A canal builder must find that hidden slope and follow it with extraordinary patience. Water cannot truly be made to flow uphill, but a well-designed channel can create that illusion, carrying the river outward across dry terraces and delivering it to places that seem higher or farther removed than gravity should allow. The first decision is where to leave the river. A canal intake cannot be placed at random. The water level must be high enough to enter the channel, and the surrounding ground must allow the canal to maintain a gentle descent from that point onward. A bend in the river may provide a favourable location where the current naturally presses against one bank. A gravel bar or low obstruction may help raise water slightly, directing part of the flow toward the canal entrance. Yet such places are temporary. Floods move sediment, cut new channels, and erase river banks. A successful intake in one generation may become useless in the next. From that uncertain beginning, the canal must cross the valley at a grade shallow enough to preserve elevation. If it descends too quickly near the river, it reaches lower ground before travelling far and cannot serve distant fields. If it hardly descends at all, the current slows, sediment settles, and the channel becomes clogged. The ideal slope balances these dangers. Water must move with enough force to continue carrying fine material, but not so violently that it scours the bed and tears through the banks. Even modern irrigation engineers calculate this relationship carefully. The ancient builders achieve it without precision instruments, relying instead on experience, observation, simple tools, and the behaviour of water itself. How they surveyed long canal routes remains one of the most intriguing questions. No single method has been preserved, and the evidence remains incomplete. Builders may have used sighting poles placed at intervals, cords stretched between points, shallow test trenches, water-filled containers, or repeated trial flows. They could observe where standing water settled and where it spilled. They could follow natural contour lines visible in vegetation, soil colour, or drainage patterns. What survives in the record suggests that they understood gradient with impressive accuracy, even if the exact techniques remain unknown. The route is rarely a straight line. A direct path may rise slightly over a low ridge that appears insignificant but is high enough to stop the flow. Instead, the canal bends around the obstacle, preserving its elevation by following the contour of the land. This is why some ancient channels curve broadly across the valley, rather than taking the shortest route toward their destination. Distance matters less than height. Every extra foot of elevation saved near the intake allows the canal to reach farther into the desert. The main channel acts as the spine of the system. Smaller branches divide from it, carrying water toward different villages and fields. These branches must be placed carefully because every diversion reduces the flow downstream. The system therefore becomes a hierarchy of channels, from large primary canals to smaller distribution ditches and finally to narrow field channels. Some are deep and wide enough to carry substantial volumes of water. Others are temporary cuts reopened or reshaped according to the planting season. Together they transform the valley into a network of moving water. The physical shape of the canal matters as much as its route. A wider channel carries more water but requires more excavation and maintenance. Banks must be strong enough to contain the flow, especially where the canal crosses loose soils. In places, the builders may line or compact vulnerable sections, though most channels depend on carefully shaped earth rather than masonry. The sides are often sloped rather than vertical, reducing collapse. As water moves through the canal, it gradually changes the channel itself, eroding one section and depositing silt in another. Design is therefore never finished. The canal must be watched, corrected, and renewed. One lesser-known difficulty comes from seepage. Dry soil absorbs water, especially when a channel is newly cut. Some loss is unavoidable, and not all of it is wasted. Moisture leaking from canals can support nearby vegetation or recharge shallow groundwater. Too much seepage, however, reduces the amount reaching distant fields. Fine sediment carried by the river may eventually seal portions of the canal bed, making them less porous. In this way, Muddy water helps the channel become more efficient even as the same sediment threatens to clog it. Control points are also necessary. Water entering a branch must be regulated, perhaps with earth, brush, stones, wooden posts, or temporary barriers that can be altered as needed. These are not permanent gates in the modern industrial sense. They are adjustable structures suited to a living system. A farmer or work group can open a passage, close another, or raise the water level enough to direct flow into a field. The method is simple in material but sophisticated in timing. Too much water can flatten young plants, erode planting beds, or saturate the soil. Too little may never reach the far edge of a field. The canal builders also have to anticipate events beyond the system. Seasonal washes descend from the mountains and may cut across canal routes. During storms, these normally dry channels become sudden torrents. A canal crossing such a wash risks being breached or buried. Builders may guide the canal around the most dangerous areas, reinforce its banks, or repeatedly reconstruct sections after damage. There is no permanent solution because the surrounding desert continues to move water according to its own patterns. As networks expand, knowledge must pass between generations. A canal several miles long cannot be understood only from one point. Someone must remember why it curves around a certain rise, where the bed tends to accumulate silt, and which section fails after heavy runoff. A small error during repair can alter the gradient and reduce flow far downstream. The channel itself becomes a record of communal experience, its shape preserving lessons learned through both success and failure. This is the real brilliance of the system. The builders do not force water across the desert through raw power. They persuade it by respecting the smallest differences in elevation. They work with gravity so subtly that the valley seems to yield more than its natural shape should permit. A river flowing through one corridor is spread across a much wider landscape, reaching fields beyond the floodplain and allowing villages to grow where rainfall alone would never sustain them. The technique looks effortless only after it succeeds. Beneath that smooth movement lies careful surveying, continual repair, and a social memory stretching across generations. The canals are not simply trenches, they are calculations written into the earth, long before anyone in the valley uses paper, metal instruments, or mechanical pumps. The elegance of a canal can make its construction seem almost abstract, as though the line simply appeared once the correct route had been found. In reality, every mile represented an enormous expenditure of human energy. Before water could move, soil had to be loosened, lifted, carried, and shaped by hand. The builders possessed no steel shovels, no wheeled excavators, no draft animals trained to pull heavy machinery, and no engines to remove earth. They worked with digging sticks, just stone tools, wooden implements, baskets, and the coordinated strength of many bodies. What looks from a distance like a graceful curve across the valley was created through thousands upon thousands of repeated motions. The first stage was clearing the route. Desert vegetation had to be cut back, roots removed, and loose stone gathered from the surface. Surveyors or experienced builders marked the desired path, but the line was only a beginning. The canal had to be opened gradually, perhaps in short connected segments, while workers checked whether the bed remained at the correct level. Soil from the trench was thrown or carried to the sides, where it helped form banks, in compact ground. Digging could be slow and punishing. In loose alluvium, the earth came away more easily, but the walls were more likely to collapse. The nature of the soil changed along the route, forcing crews to adjust their methods from one stretch to another. Excavated earth could not simply be piled without thought. Banks had to be shaped so that they strengthened rather than burdened the canal edge. A bank built too steeply might slump into the channel after rain. Material placed carelessly could redirect storm runoff or create weak points where water would later escape. Workers likely tamped portions of the banks and repaired cracks as they formed. In some places, repeated cleaning over decades created large mounds beside the canal, subtle ridges that later archaeologists could use to trace old alignments. The amount of labour depended on the canal's dimensions, the soil, and how often earlier channels could be reused. A new main canal required far more effort than reopening a small field ditch. Yet even an existing channel demanded regular attention. Sediment entered with every muddy flow. Wind blew sand into exposed reaches, plants rooted along damp banks, rodents burrowed into the sides. A fallen branch could trap debris and create a blockage that worsened rapidly. Maintenance was not an occasional emergency. It was part of the annual rhythm of survival. This labour had to be timed carefully. Major cleaning was most practical when water levels were low or when a section could be temporarily closed. That meant coordinating work with planting schedules, seasonal river conditions, and the needs of downstream fields. If cleaning began too late, crops might wait for water. If it was delayed too long, a partially blocked canal could deliver less flow just as summer heat intensified. The calendar of agriculture therefore included not only sowing and harvesting, but communal digging, bank repair, and intake reconstruction. A household could contribute several workers, but the largest canals demanded cooperation among many households and probably several villages. Organising such labour raises questions archaeology cannot answer directly. Some work may have been expected as a shared obligation attached to water access. Families receiving irrigation could owe time to cleaning the channel. Certain people may have supervised crews because of experience, age, ritual authority, or control over particular sections. Feasting may have helped bring workers together and turn hard labour into a social event. No written roster survives, and scholars still debate whether the largest projects required centralised command or could have been built through agreements among autonomous communities. The physical work itself was exhausting. Soil dug from a deepening canal had to be lifted above shoulder height or carried up sloped sides. Baskets filled with damp sediment became heavy quickly. Summer heat limited how long people could work safely in exposed ground, making early mornings and cooler seasons especially important. Dust entered the eyes and lungs, stone edges dulled or broke, wooden tools split, hands blistered, backs and knees absorbed the cost of every foot gained. The finished canal conceals all of this because successful engineering leaves behind form, not effort. Women, men, and older children may all have contributed in different ways, though the exact division of labour remains uncertain. Canal construction was connected to food preparation, tool-making, childcare, transport, and the organisation of work parties. A crew digging for hours required meals and water. Broken implements had to be repaired. Earth carriers needed baskets. People unable to excavate may still have supported the project through tasks that made large-scale labour possible. The canal was therefore built not only by those visible in the trench, but by an entire community adjusting its daily life around the work. The headworks near the river demanded especially intense effort. These diversion areas faced the strongest current and the greatest flood damage. Builders may have used brush, stones, logs, and packed earth to guide water toward the intake. Such structures were effective without being permanent. A flood could tear them apart, forcing rapid reconstruction before fields dried. This vulnerability meant that the most important parts of the system were sometimes the least durable. Archaeologists may find the canal trench but little of the temporary structure that once directed water into it. Repair after a major flood could become a crisis. A damaged canal threatened not only one harvest but the food security of entire settlements. Crews had to locate breaches, remove deposited debris, reconnect cut sections, and sometimes establish a new intake if the river had shifted. The work could not always wait for perfect conditions. It had to be completed while households were also repairing houses, replacing stored food, and recovering from the same flood that destroyed the canal. The system's growth increased both its productivity and its burden. Longer canals served more land, but they also created more points of failure. Every additional branch required cleaning. Every new village downstream depended on people upstream preserving the flow. A neglected section could reduce water for families miles away. Cooperation was therefore not an ideal added to the technology. It was built into the canal's physical structure. One of the most surprising features of these networks is how often communities return to them. Channels were deepened, widened, shifted, and reopened across generations. That persistence suggests that people inherited not only a route, but a responsibility. A canal was a long-term commitment passed from one group of workers to the next. Its survival depended less on the brilliance of its original builders than on the willingness of later communities to keep digging. The ancient canal landscape was created by engineering knowledge, but it endured through labour. Every harvest carried the memory of cleared silt, repaired banks, and exhausted crews. Water reached the fields because people repeatedly entered the trench and remade the system before the desert and river could reclaim it. As the canals lengthen, the settlements beside them begin to change. Water no longer serves only a cluster of fields near the river. It becomes the organizing line around which villages are built, expanded and connected. Houses gather close enough to share access but far enough apart to leave room for work areas, storage pits, paths, refuse deposits, and small cultivated spaces. From the main canal, narrower branches carry water toward different portions of the settlement. And from those branches, still smaller ditches feed individual fields. The arrangement is practical, but it also creates a new kind of social geography, where a household lives, which branch it uses, and how far it stands from the main flow may affect when water arrives and how reliably crops can be grown. The larger settlements are not random collections of houses. They contain groups of domestic compounds, often separated by open space or low boundaries, suggesting communities organized at several levels. A household belongs to a compound, the compound belongs to a village, and the village belongs to a larger irrigation system. These layers overlap. People cook and sleep within the household, cooperate with nearby relatives and neighbours, and join broader work parties when the canal requires cleaning. The result is neither a completely centralised city nor a loose scattering of independent farms. It is a landscape of linked communities whose daily lives depend on shared infrastructure. Fields spread outward from the canals in patterns that are difficult to reconstruct beneath modern development. Some may have been divided into long rectangular plots, while others followed the shape of the terrain or older channels. Earthen borders help control the movement of water. Farmers could flood a small area, allow the soil to absorb moisture, then redirect the flow into another plot. The timing had to be precise. Maize needed water at critical stages of growth. Cotton demanded a longer season. Squash could spread between rows, shading the soil and reducing evaporation. Beans, introduced into the regional farming system over time, added both food and agricultural diversity. The fields were not all planted at once, nor were they necessarily used in the same way every year. Some land lay close to dependable branches and could be cultivated repeatedly. Other plots were more experimental, opened when water was abundant and abandoned when sediment, salinity, or shifting flow made them less productive. Farmers adjusted planting times to winter moisture, spring river levels, and summer heat. They may have produced more than one crop in favourable years, though the exact intensity varied across periods and locations. What survives in the record suggests a flexible system rather than a single rigid agricultural calendar. Water also transformed the spaces immediately around the villages. Canal seepage created damp margins where plants grew more thickly than in the surrounding desert. These green corridors could provide reeds, grasses, medicinal plants, shade, and habitat for birds and small animals. Trees such as cottonwood and willow favoured wetter soils, while mesquite flourished where roots could reach moisture below the surface. A canal was therefore more than a conduit. It created a narrow artificial ecosystem running through the settlement, changing what could grow and which animals appeared nearby. This abundance brought problems as well. Standing water and muddy banks could attract insects. Damp soil weakened walls if houses stood too close to leaking channels. Children and animals could fall into deeper canals. Rodents were drawn to stored grain and irrigated vegetation. Mosquitoes may have increased around slow-moving or pooled water, although the archaeological evidence for specific disease patterns remains incomplete. The same system that made village life possible also introduced hazards absent from drier parts of the landscape. Food production extended far beyond the moment of harvest. Maize had to be dried, shelled, ground, cooked, and stored. Grinding stones became central household tools, and years of use wore deep surfaces into them. Storage pits or above-ground facilities protected food from heat, moisture, insects, and animals. Cotton required cleaning, spinning, and weaving before it became cloth. Squash seeds could be roasted, while dried flesh and maize supported households through seasons when fresh food was scarce. The village hummed with activities connected indirectly to the canals, even when no one was standing in a field. One lesser-known consequence of irrigation was its effect on fuel. Large settled populations needed firewood for cooking, warmth, pottery production, and craft work. Nearby trees and shrubs could be depleted if harvesting exceeded regrowth. People may have travelled farther over time to collect wood or manage certain species carefully. The canals encouraged permanent settlement, but permanent settlement concentrated demand on the surrounding desert. Every successful harvest increased the number of mouths supported by the system and the amount of material the village required. Domestic architecture also reflects adaptation to heat. Houses built partly below ground benefited from the cooler earth. While thick walls and roof materials slowed temperature changes, activity shifted with the day. Work exposed to the sun was easier in the morning or evening. Midday encouraged movement into shade, enclosed spaces, or beneath ramadas. Water jars were placed where evaporation could cool their contents. The village's rhythm followed both the irrigation schedule and the daily passage of heat. Access to water was unlikely to have been perfectly equal. Households near an upstream branch may have received flow sooner, while those farther away faced greater uncertainty. Yet proximity alone did not determine advantage. Social relationships, labour contributions, inherited rights, and agreements between compounds may all have shaped distribution. Archaeologists can map canals and houses, but they cannot hear the negotiations that occurred beside them. Scholars still debate whether water rights belonged mainly to households, kin groups, villages, or larger canal associations, and the answer may have changed through time. Disputes were probably unavoidable. An upstream farmer could hold water too long. A damaged gate could reduce flow to an entire branch. A family that failed to join a cleaning crew might still expect irrigation. Such tensions did not necessarily lead to violence. Most were likely resolved through custom, obligation, reputation, and repeated negotiation. Everyone understood that the system would collapse if every household acted only for itself. The canal forced cooperation not because people were naturally harmonious, but because dependence made compromise necessary. Villages also contained residents whose work was not limited to farming. Potters shaped vessels for cooking and storage. Shell workers transformed imported marine material into ornaments. Stoneworkers produced tools from rock gathered locally or obtained through exchange. Weavers turned cotton into textiles. Hunters and gatherers continued moving through the desert beyond the irrigated zone. Agricultural surplus gave some people more time for specialized production. Yet even skilled craftspeople remained tied to the water system that fed them. By now, the canal is no longer merely an engineering project passing through the settlement. It is the settlement's central structure, shaping where people live, how they work, what they eat, and with whom they must cooperate. The village grows around moving water as a living arrangement between households, fields, desert resources, and the river. Every branch channel carries more than irrigation. It carries obligation, opportunity, and the possibility that a decision made upstream will be felt at a doorway far below. By the time the Great Canal systems reach their fullest extent, the Salt and Gila river valleys no longer contain isolated farming villages linked by a few local ditches. They contain entire hydraulic landscapes. Main canals leave the rivers at carefully chosen points, then divide again and again as they move across the basin. Some channels extend for many miles. Some are broad enough to carry water for several settlements at once. Their branches spread across thousands of acres of fields, binding communities together through a shared dependence on the same intake, the same gradient, and the same seasonal flow. In scale and complexity, these networks stand among the most remarkable achievements of ancient North America. The Salt River system in the Phoenix Basin becomes especially impressive. On both sides of the river, major canals curve outward across the terraces, reaching land far beyond the natural floodplain. Individual networks may include a large primary canal, secondary branches, distribution channels, and hundreds of smaller field ditches. Archaeologists often describe them as separate systems because each appears to have drawn water from a particular section of the river. But in practice, the landscape was more fluid. Canals were enlarged, replaced, abandoned, and sometimes linked to newer routes. Their boundaries changed as villages grew and as the river shifted. Estimating the total length of these ancient works is difficult because modern construction has destroyed or concealed so much of the evidence. Early surveys recorded channels before roads, housing developments, and industrial districts erased their surface traces. Excavations made during construction have revealed other sections beneath the city. Taken together, the surviving evidence suggests hundreds of miles of canals across central Arizona. With some individual main channels extending more than 10 miles, the precise figures remain debated because one canal may have been recut repeatedly, creating overlapping features that are difficult to count separately. The largest channels were not necessarily filled to their banks at all times. Their dimensions reflected the need to handle variable flow, maintenance, and future expansion. During high water, they could carry substantial volumes into the valley. During low water, only a narrower stream might move along the bottom. This flexibility mattered because river discharge changed from season to season and year to year. A system designed only for average conditions would fail during drought or be overwhelmed during flood. The canals also reveal long-term planning. A main channel had to preserve enough elevation to supply distant branches, including fields that might not yet have been opened when the first trench was dug. In some places, later communities deepened or widened older canals rather than beginning again. This suggests that routes were understood as inherited assets, tested by time and embedded in the social memory of the valley. A canal alignment could outlive individual villages, serving new settlements after earlier ones declined or moved. Along the Gila River, irrigation networks developed under different local conditions but with similar principles. Communities near modern-day Coolidge, Florence, and the Middle Gila built extensive systems that supported large villages and ceremonial centres. The river there could be broad and unpredictable, and its channel shifted across the floodplain. Farmers responded by adapting headworks and canal routes to changing conditions. The result was not a single master system but a series of regional networks, each shaped by the character of the river and the communities depending upon it. These systems allowed populations to grow beyond what rainfall agriculture alone could sustain. Large villages emerged near important canal junctions or along main distribution routes. Some included hundreds of households, public spaces, ball courts, platform mounds, and extensive craft areas. Smaller settlements occupied the surrounding fields and branches. The pattern resembles a constellation rather than a single compact city. Population was distributed across the irrigated landscape, with major centres connected to outlying communities through water, exchange, ritual, and kinship. A lesser-known feature of these networks is how they created overlapping zones of dependence. A village might sit beside one branch while relying on maintenance performed far upstream by people it rarely encountered. Damage near the river could reduce water across an enormous area. Conversely, a successful repair could benefit households miles away. The canal system therefore produced a form of regional interdependence that exceeded ordinary face-to-face village life. People had to cooperate with strangers, distant relatives, or neighbouring communities whose interests were not always identical. This scale raises difficult questions about authority. Could several villages maintain a canal more than 10 miles long through informal agreement alone? Or did powerful leaders coordinate work and control access? Archaeologists have proposed both cooperative and hierarchical models. Some argue that canal associations may have been organised through kinship, ritual obligations, and negotiated rights, with leadership remaining limited and practical. Others see the size of the networks as evidence that influential households or ceremonial authorities directed labour and distribution. No single explanation fully accounts for every system, and organisation probably changed as networks expanded. The canals themselves do not reveal whether orders were given or agreements reached by consensus. They show only that large numbers of people succeeded in keeping water moving, that success required regular communication. Work crews needed to know when a section would be closed. Farmers downstream had to prepare for interruptions. Diversions had to be adjusted during changing river levels. Conflicts over timing and quantity had to be resolved before they endangered the entire network. The larger the system became, the more important these arrangements grew. Expansion also carried environmental costs. More irrigated land meant more water removed from the river. Longer channels increased seepage and evaporation. Intensive cultivation raised the risk of salinity and soil exhaustion. Sediment accumulated in main canals, requiring deeper cleaning and larger crews. A network could become so extensive that its maintenance burden approached the limits of the population it supported. Yet the evidence of repeated enlargement shows that, for long periods, the benefits outweighed those risks. The canal builders did not transform the Sonoran Desert into a permanently green plain. The landscape remained uneven. Fields flourished beside dry stretches. Villages clustered near reliable branches while other areas were used only temporarily. Beyond the irrigated zone, Desert vegetation and mountain ridges continued almost unchanged. The achievement lay not in erasing the desert, but in creating broad corridors of cultivation within it, sustained by knowledge, labour, and cooperation. From a distance, the networks might have appeared as green bands spreading outward from the rivers, broken by houses, footpaths, groves, and open spaces. Water moved quietly through channels whose construction represented generations of accumulated experience. The scale was immense, but the system remained intimate at its edges, where a farmer opened a small earthen barrier and watched the flow enter a field. By linking that field to villages many miles upstream, the canal networks turned local agriculture into a regional civilization. Their greatest monument was not a wall or pyramid rising above the valley, it was the valley itself, reorganized around the controlled movement of water. Once the canal networks begin producing reliable surpluses, the desert villages become connected to worlds far beyond their fields. Water creates more than food. It creates time, concentration, and exchange. A household that harvests enough maize, beans, squash, and cotton to survive the lean seasons may also produce goods for trade. A village able to support large gatherings can attract visitors from neighbouring valleys. A regional centre supplied by several canals can become a place where objects, information, ceremonies, and obligations circulate together. The irrigated landscape is no longer only a system of production. It becomes the foundation of a social world stretching across hundreds of miles. The clearest evidence of those wider connections appears in materials that do not naturally belong in the Salt or Gila River valleys. Marine shells arrive from the Gulf of California, carried inland through networks of exchange. Some remain recognizable as bracelets, pendants, rings, beads, and small ornaments. Others are cut into blanks or broken pieces, showing that craftspeople work the raw material locally. Shell was not merely decorative. It carried the distance of the coast into the desert, turning a fragment of the sea into an object of status, identity, ritual meaning, or personal attachment. One especially surprising craft involved etched shell. Artisans coated portions of a shell surface with a protective substance, then exposed the remaining areas to acidic liquid made from desert plants. The acid altered the uncovered surface, producing pale designs against darker backgrounds. The technique required experimentation and close control, and it represents one of the most distinctive artistic practices associated with the region. The finished pieces demonstrate that ancient desert communities were not culturally isolated or devoted only to survival. They invested time in beauty, symbolism, and skilled production. Other materials travelled through the same broad networks. Obsidian arrived from volcanic sources beyond the immediate valleys. Turquoise, pigments, unusual stones, and certain pottery styles reveal contact between communities separated by mountains and deserts. Cotton grown in irrigated fields could be spun into thread and woven into textiles, creating a valuable product suited to long-distance exchange. Food may also have moved between regions. Though it leaves fewer obvious traces than stone or shell, dried maize, seeds, woven cloth, crafted ornaments, and knowledge could pass from settlement to settlement through repeated short journeys, rather than a single caravan crossing the entire southwest. These exchanges connected the canal communities with neighbouring cultural regions and, indirectly, with parts of Mesoamerica. Archaeologists have long noted similarities in certain objects and practices, including copper bells, macaws, ball courts, and architectural forms. Yet resemblance does not prove political control or large-scale migration. Scholars still debate how ideas moved and how direct the contacts were. The evidence more strongly suggests networks of trade, pilgrimage, imitation, and selective adoption than a foreign empire governing the Sonoran Desert. Among the most visible signs of these connections are the ball courts found at many settlements. These are not enclosed stone stadiums like those of some Mesoamerican cities. They are usually large oval or elongated depressions surrounded by raised earthen embankments. Their exact use remains uncertain. Games probably occurred within them, but the rules, equipment, and meanings have not survived. Some researchers have proposed that players used rubber balls or other objects, while others emphasize the court's roles as gathering places for ceremonies, markets, performances, and public negotiations. No single explanation fully accounts for all of the evidence. The courts vary greatly in size. Some could accommodate relatively small local audiences, while others were large enough to draw visitors from a broad area. Their construction required collective labour, but less than the excavation of a major canal. A village might build one to announce its place within a regional network, or to host periodic events that reinforced relationships among dispersed communities. The ball court becomes a public stage where the social landscape created by irrigation can be seen and renewed. On gathering days, the ordinary rhythm of the village may have changed completely. Paths filled with visitors approaching from canal branches, river crossings, and desert trails. Potters brought vessels, farmers carried surplus food, shell workers displayed ornaments, weavers offered cotton cloth or thread, hunters and gatherers arrived with materials from upland or desert zones. Ceremonies, games, exchange, feasting, and courtship could occur within the same event. The archaeological record preserves the structures and objects, but only faintly captures the human density of such occasions. Markets in this world may not have operated like permanent commercial districts with fixed prices and professional merchants. Exchange could include barter, reciprocal gifts, ceremonial distribution, and relationships built across repeated visits. Value was social as well as material. A shell bracelet might represent access to coastal routes. A decorated vessel might carry the reputation of its maker or community. Food given during a feast could establish an obligation that returned years later as labour, hospitality, or political support. Irrigation surplus made these gatherings possible, but gatherings also helped maintain irrigation society. People who worked different sections of a canal needed opportunities to negotiate and recognise shared interests. Public events allowed communities to display generosity, resolve disputes, arrange cooperative labour, and reinforce the stories or rituals that connected them. A canal system joined people materially. Ceremonies and exchange helped join them socially. Regional integration can also be seen in pottery. Certain decorative traditions spread widely, while local variations remained strong. Vessels moved between settlements, carrying both goods and visual styles. Archaeologists use changes in pottery forms and designs to trace interaction, chronology, and identity. But the meanings once attached to those patterns remain largely inaccessible. A painted motif may have identified a family, place, ritual association, or simply an aesthetic preference. What survives in the record suggests both shared cultural language and considerable local creativity. The network was not equal in every direction. Some settlements occupied strategic positions near major canal junctions, river crossings, or routes into the mountains. These places could accumulate influence by hosting gatherings or controlling access to valued goods. Larger villages may have served as regional hubs, but smaller communities were not passive satellites. They produced crops, crafts, and knowledge essential to the wider system. The relationships between centres and outlying settlements probably shifted over time, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive. Abundance also created opportunities for display. Households able to sponsor feasts, acquire distant ornaments, or organise public work could build prestige. Leadership may have emerged through generosity as much as command. A respected family might distribute food during ceremonies, assist in canal repairs, or maintain relationships with distant communities. Over generations, however, prestige could harden into privilege. The same networks that connected villages could allow certain groups to concentrate influence. For centuries, the ball court seemed to embody an outward-looking regional world, one in which communities meet through exchange and public gatherings. Later, many courts fall out of use, while other architectural forms become more prominent. That change suggests not merely a shift in recreation, but a reorganization of social life. The open arena that once drew people together begins to give way to spaces that appear more enclosed, restricted, and controlled. Before that transformation, however, the canal valleys stand at the center of a remarkable desert network. Water feeds cotton, cotton becomes thread, thread, shell, stone, food, and ideas move along trails. Villages that might seem isolated on a modern map are connected by repeated journeys and shared institutions. The canals carry water across the valley, while the markets and ball courts carry something less visible but equally necessary: trust, competition, memory, and the knowledge that the desert world extends far beyond the horizon. As exchange networks widen and major villages gain influence, the most difficult question becomes less visible than a ball court or platform mound. It lies inside the flow itself. who decides when water moves, who receives it first, and who bears the cost when it does not arrive. A canal may look like a neutral piece of infrastructure, but every diversion creates winners and risks. Water entering an upstream field is water temporarily withheld from everyone below. A branch opened for one village may reduce pressure in another. During seasons of abundance, these tensions can remain manageable. During low flow, they become questions of survival. The physical system encourages coordination at several levels. Individual households manage small field channels, but they cannot control the main canal alone. A neighbourhood may maintain a secondary branch, while several villages share responsibility for the primary channel and river intake. This layered structure suggests that authority was distributed rather than concentrated in a single place. Different decisions required different groups. A family could choose when to irrigate a garden plot, but rebuilding a destroyed headwork demanded cooperation across the entire network. One influential interpretation imagines canal communities organized through associations of farmers who shared both water and labor. Membership may have depended on residence, kinship, inherited rights, or participation in maintenance. Those who contributed to clearing the canal could claim access to its flow. Experienced individuals may have coordinated schedules and supervised repairs without possessing absolute power. Their authority would have been practical and conditional, lasting only as long as they maintained trust and demonstrated knowledge. Such a system does not require a king or permanent bureaucracy. Small-scale societies can organize impressive communal works through custom, obligation, and repeated negotiation. Everyone knows that refusing to repair the canal will eventually harm the refuser as well. Reputation matters. A household that repeatedly avoids communal labor may lose support during a crisis or face restrictions on water access. Cooperation is enforced not only by leaders but by the knowledge that neighbors remember. Yet the largest networks complicate this picture. When a canal stretches for many miles and serves several settlements, personal familiarity becomes less reliable. Upstream and downstream communities may have different interests. People near the intake face the greatest responsibility for protecting the diversion, while distant farmers depend on decisions they cannot easily observe. Communication must cross a wider landscape. Work crews must be assembled in sufficient numbers. Conflicts must be resolved before resentment turns into sabotage, abandonment, or migration. This has led some archaeologists to propose more formal leadership. Influential households, ritual specialists, or village authorities may have directed labor and allocated water. Control of ceremonial knowledge could reinforce control of practical resources, especially if farming schedules were tied to observations of seasons, stars, and ritual calendars. A leader who predicted planting times, organized canal cleaning, and hosted communal feasts might appear to stand at the center of both natural and social order. The evidence for such control is indirect. Archaeologists look for differences in house size, burial treatment, access to exotic goods, storage capacity, and proximity to public architecture. They study whether certain compounds occupy privileged positions near major canals or ceremonial structures. They ask whether large projects appeared suddenly, suggesting centralized direction, or grew gradually through repeated communal effort. The patterns are suggestive but rarely decisive. Scholars still debate whether canal leadership created durable political elites or remained temporary and task-based. The canals themselves may preserve traces of negotiation. Some networks are divided into branches that seem to serve relatively distinct settlement groups. This could reflect agreements granting each community a recognized portion of the flow. In other places, channels are reorganized, perhaps after population growth, conflict, flood damage, or changing political relationships. A new branch may represent expansion, but it might also indicate that one group sought greater independence from another. Water scheduling probably varied through the year. During high river flow, several branches could operate simultaneously. During scarcity, communities may have rotated access, allowing one area to irrigate before closing its gate and passing water onward. Night irrigation may have reduced evaporation, though it would have required careful supervision in darkness. Timing could be measured through the sun, stars, shadows, or agreed sequences rather than clocks. A household might receive water after another field was completed, making the schedule relational rather than fixed to an exact hour. Any system of rotation depended on trust. An upstream farmer could extend an irrigation turn or secretly weaken a barrier to capture additional flow. A downstream household might accuse others of taking more than their share when the true cause was seepage, sediment, or falling river levels. Because the water was constantly changing, fairness could be difficult to prove. A decision accepted in one year might become intolerable in the next. Conflict therefore did not need to take the form of open warfare. It could appear as delayed maintenance, refusal to join a work crew, unauthorized cuts in a canal bank, or migration to another branch. A family might leave a settlement not because the whole system had failed, but because its place within that system had become untenable. Archaeology can reveal abandoned houses and altered channels, yet the personal disputes behind them usually disappear. Ritual may have helped contain these tensions. Ceremonies connected water to shared meanings larger than individual advantage. Feasting transformed canal labour into a public obligation and an opportunity for prestige. Leaders who distributed food after repairs could turn coordination into generosity rather than command. Stories linking communities to rivers, mountains, rain, and ancestors may have reinforced the idea that water was not simply a private possession. Among descendant Odom peoples, water, land, community, and sacred geography remain deeply connected, though modern tradition should not be projected unchanged into every archaeological period. Another possibility is that authority shifted according to circumstance. In ordinary years, local groups may have managed water cooperatively. During floods or droughts, stronger leaders could emerge to coordinate emergency work. Once the crisis passed, their power might diminish. Over generations, however, temporary authority can become inherited. A household that repeatedly controls important decisions may gain privileged access to goods, marriage alliances, and ceremonial roles. This gradual transformation would be difficult to detect until it appeared in architecture. A canal manager leaves no written title, but a family with growing influence may build a larger compound, accumulate exotic ornaments, or sponsor public construction. Control over water may therefore have been one path toward inequality, though it was probably not the only one. Trade, ritual knowledge, military alliances, and control of food surpluses could all contribute. No single political model fits every valley or century. Some canal systems may have been broadly cooperative, while others became more hierarchical. Authority may have differed between large river settlements and smaller communities. It may also have changed as populations grew and environmental pressures intensified. What remains clear is that water management was never purely technical. Every gate, work party, and irrigation turn carried a social decision. The canal builders succeeded for centuries because they found ways to make those decisions collectively, even when interests differed. But the larger the networks became, the harder that balance was to preserve. The same channels that united communities also created positions from which influence could be accumulated. As public spaces changed and certain settlements became more imposing, the question of who controlled the water began to merge with a broader question: who controlled the canal world itself? The change does not arrive as a sudden revolution. No surviving layer marks the day when cooperative canal communities become something more divided, more enclosed, or more politically complex. Instead, the transformation appears gradually in the arrangement of settlements. Ball courts that once served as open gathering places decline in importance. New compounds are surrounded by walls. Platform mounds rise above nearby houses, not as enormous pyramids, but as elevated structures built through repeated additions of earth, stone, and debris. Their height is modest compared with the monumental architecture of Mesoamerica, yet in the level river valleys they would have been conspicuous. They altered both the physical skyline and the social meaning of space. A platform mound was usually not an empty ceremonial hill. Buildings stood on its summit, while retaining walls or compacted layers supported the raised surface. Some mounds were expanded several times, suggesting that communities continued investing labor in them across generations. Access may have been controlled through ramps, passages, gates, or surrounding compounds. From the top, a person could look across houses, fields, and canal corridors. More importantly, people below could see that certain activities occurred above them. Exactly what happened on these platforms remains uncertain. Archaeologists have proposed ceremonial gatherings, elite residences, storage, administrative functions, and combinations of all four. Some buildings may have sheltered ritual specialists or influential families. Others may have held valued objects, food, or materials used in communal events. The evidence remains incomplete because many structures were damaged by erosion, looting, agriculture, and modern construction. Even where architecture survives, it rarely reveals whether a room belonged to a priest, a canal official, a respected elder, or an ordinary household performing a specialized duty. The location of the mounds nevertheless suggests that they mattered beyond domestic life. Many stand within large settlements associated with extensive irrigation systems. They appear during a period when populations are concentrated into fewer, often larger communities, and when some residential compounds become more formally enclosed, walls guide movement, separate spaces, and limit visibility. The older ball court world seems to have emphasized broad public assembly. The mound and compound world appears more restricted, though the contrast should not be made too absolute. Open gatherings continued, and ball courts may still have been remembered or used in some places. Social change is rarely neat. One possible explanation is that increasing population made older forms of organization less effective. A small network of villages might manage water through personal relationships and periodic gatherings. A larger population concentrated along heavily used canals required more regular coordination. Leaders who supervised repairs, settled disputes, organized ceremonies, and stored surplus could gradually acquire lasting authority. Platform mounds may have provided central places from which these responsibilities were carried out. In this interpretation, hierarchy emerged partly as a practical response to complexity. Yet practical authority can become privilege. A household responsible for communal storage may gain influence over when food is distributed. A ritual specialist who controls access to ceremonies may shape political alliances. A family coordinating canal labour may learn which villages are vulnerable and which fields produce the largest harvests. Over time, such knowledge and responsibility can be passed to descendants. What begins as service to the community may become a claim to elevated status. Burials and prestige goods provide hints of inequality, though the patterns are not simple. Some individuals were interred with ornaments, vessels, shell, or other valued objects, while others received little material accompaniment. Certain households had greater access to imported goods or specialized crafts. Larger compounds may indicate larger kin groups, accumulated wealth, or greater political importance. But differences in burial treatment can also reflect age, ritual role, personal identity, or changing customs rather than social class alone. Scholars still debate how sharply ranked these communities became. The platform mound itself may have served as a powerful symbol regardless of who lived there. It was constructed from the labour of many people, but could make a small group appear elevated above the rest. Workers carried basket after basket of soil to create an artificial height in a landscape governed by nearly invisible slopes. The same society that had learned to read tiny differences in elevation for water now created elevation for social purposes. This may not have been accidental. Height could separate sacred space from ordinary ground, bring ceremonies closer to the sky, or display authority over the surrounding settlement. Mounds were also connected to enclosed residential compounds. These compounds contained clusters of houses, courtyards, storage spaces, and work areas surrounded by walls. The boundaries may have protected residents, controlled animals, marked kin group territory, or limited entry. They also made social divisions more visible. A person approaching no longer moved freely through an open collection of houses. Entrances directed movement, and walls concealed activities inside. This architectural change may reflect insecurity as well as hierarchy. Communities faced competition over land, water, trade, and labour. Consolidating into larger settlements could provide protection and stronger access to canal systems. Enclosures might reduce theft or mark claims during periods when resources were becoming harder to share. Evidence of violence exists at some sites, but it does not support a simple picture of constant warfare. Conflict may have been episodic, local, and intertwined with political rivalry rather than a single regional collapse into chaos. Another interpretation sees the mound centres as parts of broader religious communities. Ritual authority may have linked villages that shared canals, ceremonies, and sacred landscapes. Leaders residing near mounds might have gained influence because they mediated relationships between people, ancestors, rain, and river water. Agricultural success depended on forces that no engineering system could fully control. Ceremonies offered a way to confront drought, flood, illness, and uncertainty through collective action. Those who directed such ceremonies occupied powerful positions, even if they did not command labor through force. Food and feasting likely played a role. Large gatherings required stored maize, prepared meals, pottery, fuel, and coordinated work. A household or institution capable of hosting a feast could demonstrate abundance and generosity. Guests left fed, indebted, reassured, or politically aligned. The exchange of food transformed agricultural surplus into influence. Platform mounds and enclosed compounds may have been stages where this conversion took place. The connection to canals remained fundamental. A mound centre without water could not feed its population or support repeated ceremonies. Its authority depended on the productivity of fields and the cooperation of people maintaining the channels. Leaders who became too demanding risked losing support. Communities could resist, abandon a branch, or move elsewhere. Hierarchy therefore remained constrained by the same infrastructure that helped create it. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of platform mounds. They may have been ceremonial, political, residential, economic, and defensive at different times or all at once. Their meaning likely varied between settlements. What they reveal most clearly is that the canal world was changing. Public life became more concentrated. Boundaries hardened. Certain places rose physically and symbolically above others. The canals still carried water through the valley, but the society around them was no longer organized exactly as before. The old networks had produced abundance, population growth, and regional connection. They had also created opportunities for influence to gather around particular families, compounds, and ceremonial centers. As these differences became embedded in architecture, the balance between cooperation and control grew more delicate. That balance would soon be tested by forces no mound, leader, or irrigation schedule could fully master. The canal system appears powerful when water is moving, but its greatest weakness is hidden inside its success. Every new field, every enlarged village, and every additional branch channel adds another demand to a network that must remain perfectly balanced. The builders can deepen a canal, strengthen a bank, or shift an intake, but they cannot control the river itself. Nor can they prevent the slow changes taking place within the soil. By the later centuries of the canal world, the engineering has become more sophisticated than ever, yet the system is also carrying more people, more crops, and more risk than before. Sediment is among the most persistent problems. The Salt and Gila rivers carry enormous quantities of sand, silt, and clay, especially during floods. When water enters a canal, some of that material travels with it. As the current slows, heavier particles settle first, gradually raising the canal bed. The channel becomes shallower, reducing how much water it can carry. Flow slows further, causing even more sediment to accumulate. If workers do not remove it quickly, a productive canal can begin choking itself. Cleaning a major channel means lifting countless baskets of wet soil from the bed and carrying them to the banks. The work becomes harder as canals deepen, because sediment must be raised farther. A network that once required a modest seasonal clearing may eventually demand large crews for extended periods. The removed earth forms ridges beside the canal, but those ridges can create new problems. Rainwater may erode them back into the channel, while thick banks may conceal leaks and animal burrows until they collapse. Erosion threatens the opposite kind of failure. If the canal becomes too steep in one stretch, or if water is suddenly released at high volume, the current can cut into the bottom. The channel deepens unevenly, and may begin drawing water away from branches designed for a higher level. Banks undercut by the current collapse, sending more soil into the flow. A small damaged section can expand rapidly, transforming a controlled channel into a destructive gully. Workers may repair it with packed earth, brush, stones, or a redirected route, but every emergency consumes labor needed elsewhere. The headworks remain especially vulnerable. These structures guide river water into the main canal, yet they stand where the current is strongest. A low water year may leave the intake above the river's reduced surface, starving the system even though water still flows in the channel below. A flood may destroy the diversion entirely or bury the entrance beneath gravel. The river can also shift sideways, abandoning the intake and forcing builders to cut a new connection. The most carefully maintained canal in the valley is useless if water cannot enter it. Fields face their own slower crisis. Irrigation water contains dissolved minerals. When that water evaporates beneath intense desert heat, some minerals remain in the soil. Over years, salts may accumulate near the surface, especially where drainage is poor. Crops become less productive. Leaves yellow, seedlings struggle, and fields that once yielded reliably begin demanding more water for smaller harvests. Farmers can flush salts downward when water is plentiful, improve drainage. Shift cultivation, or temporarily abandon damaged plots. But these responses require land and water that may already be under pressure. Waterlogging creates another danger. An over-irrigated field may remain saturated below the surface, depriving roots of air and bringing salts upward. Canal seepage can raise the local water table, turning once fertile ground into heavy, difficult soil. The signs may appear gradually, making the problem hard to recognize until yields have already declined. The very act that creates agricultural abundance can slowly damage the land supporting it. Not every field suffers equally. Differences in soil, elevation, and distance from the canal create a patchwork of productivity. Some plots remain fertile for generations, while others are abandoned and replaced. This flexibility helps the system endure, but it also produces competition. Families with access to better drained land or more reliable branches possess an advantage. Those pushed toward the far ends of the network face greater losses from seepage, evaporation, and low flow. Environmental inequality can become social inequality. Upstream communities hold another advantage. They receive water before it has traveled through miles of leaking channels. During drought, they may still irrigate while downstream fields remain dry. Even without deliberate theft, the structure of the system favors those closest to the river. Agreements and water rotations can reduce this imbalance, but they cannot erase it. If upstream farmers take slightly more than their share, downstream losses become severe. A dispute that begins with a temporary shortage can harden into a lasting political division. The system also depends on population stability. Large canals need many workers. If disease, migration, conflict, or poor harvests reduce the available labour force, maintenance suffers. A partially blocked canal then delivers less water, lowering food production and encouraging still more people to leave. This creates a dangerous cycle. Declining population weakens the infrastructure, and weakened infrastructure drives further decline. An irrigation society can therefore unravel not because every canal fails at once, but because fewer people remain able or willing to perform the work. Scholars still debate whether canal maintenance ever exceeded the organisational capacity of particular communities. There is no surviving account of crews refusing to work or leaders failing to coordinate repairs. Archaeology shows altered channels, abandoned fields, and shifting settlements, but the reasons behind those changes remain incomplete. Some adjustments may represent ordinary adaptation rather than crisis. A village can move because a canal is improved elsewhere, not because its old location has become unlivable. Pests and crop diseases add further uncertainty. Concentrated fields provide dependable food not only for people, but for rodents, birds, insects, and plant pathogens. Storage facilities can be invaded. A poor maize harvest may be followed by losses in stored grain. Diversifying crops and gathering wild foods reduces the danger, but growing populations increasingly depend on irrigated production. As reliance grows, even a moderate decline in yield becomes harder to absorb. Fuel and construction materials also become scarcer around long-occupied settlements. Trees cut for roof beams and firewood take time to return. People travel farther to gather brush and timber, increasing the daily cost of village life. Canal banks and fields occupy land once used for wild plants. Hunting pressure may reduce nearby game. The irrigated zone remains productive, but its surrounding support system can gradually thin. None of these pressures alone destroys the canal world. Sediment can be cleared, salty fields can be wrested, headworks can be rebuilt, villagers can negotiate new schedules. The people of the valleys have solved such problems for centuries. The danger lies in accumulation. A damaged intake coincides with a labour shortage. A drought follows years of declining soil productivity. Political disputes delay repairs just when river flow becomes unreliable. Engineering can answer individual failures. but it cannot always answer many failures arriving together. The canal builders never lose their skill. Their vulnerability comes from the opposite condition. They have built a society so deeply dependent on successful water management that every weakness in the system carries consequences far beyond the channel itself. The canals remain brilliant instruments, but they are no longer merely helping people live in the desert. They are holding an entire regional world in place. For generations, the canal communities survive because they know how to recover from disaster. A flood tears through a diversion, and crews rebuild it. A channel fills with sediment, and workers clear it. A dry year reduces the harvest, and stored food, wild resources, exchange partners, and neighbouring fields soften the loss. The strength of the system lies not in avoiding crisis, but in absorbing it. Yet during the 14th century, the pattern of environmental disturbance appears to become more difficult to absorb. Floods arrive with enough force to damage major canals and alter river channels, while periods of reduced flow follow before communities have fully recovered. The problem is not a single catastrophe, it is the sequence. A destructive flood can look like abundance from a distance. Water spreads across the valley, filling abandoned channels and turning normally dry ground into a shining plain. For farmers, however, uncontrolled water is fundamentally different from irrigation. It tears through canal banks, buries fields beneath sand and gravel, and deposits trees and debris where crops once grew. Houses near the floodplain may collapse as walls soften or foundations are undercut. Storage pits fill with mud. Footpaths disappear. Livestock, tools, seed, and harvested food can be lost within hours. Even when the water withdraws, the work of recovery begins in a landscape whose familiar boundaries have been erased. The largest floods are capable of changing the Salt or Gila River itself. A river channel that had remained near a canal intake for decades can shift across the floodplain, leaving the entrance stranded beside a shallow backwater. Elsewhere, the new current may cut directly through a canal, splitting it into disconnected sections. The builders then face an urgent choice. They can attempt to reconnect the old system to the new river course, excavating a fresh intake and perhaps miles of replacement channel, or they can abandon parts of the network and concentrate labour elsewhere. Neither option is simple when thousands of people depend on the next planting. Flood deposits discovered in the valley suggest episodes of powerful river activity during the late prehistoric period. Their exact dates and effects vary between locations, and scholars still debate how closely particular floods correspond with changes in settlement. A layer of sand over a field proves that water crossed it, but not whether the inhabitants fled permanently, returned after a season, or shifted cultivation a short distance away. Archaeological evidence records physical disturbance more clearly than human decision. Even so, the repeated rebuilding and rerouting of canals shows that some communities face substantial hydraulic instability. Flood damage becomes especially dangerous when followed by drought. After high water has destroyed a diversion, a reduced river may not rise enough to enter the repaired canal. The channel has been cleared, the banks rebuilt, and the workers assembled, but gravity offers no water to move. A new intake can be cut lower, yet doing so changes the elevation available to the entire system. Distant branches may become unreachable. Fields at the far end of the network are the first to lose dependable irrigation, forcing households to compete for land closer to the river or to rely more heavily on uncertain rainfall and wild foods. Tree ring evidence from the wider southwest reveals periods of drought during these centuries, though conditions were not identical everywhere. Mountain snowpack, winter storms, summer monsoons, and local river flows could vary independently. One valley might suffer while another received adequate water. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single climatic record can describe the experience of every canal community. Nevertheless, extended dry intervals would have reduced both irrigation supplies and the wild resources used to survive poor harvests. Mesquite pods, cactus fruit, game, and gathered seeds also respond to rainfall. The desert's backup foods are not immune to drought. The timing of these events matters as much as their severity. A community can endure one poor harvest if storage is full. It can recover from one flood if neighbouring settlements remain productive. But a sequence of damaged fields, reduced river flow, and uncertain rainfall drains those reserves. Seed maize intended for planting may be eaten. Exchange partners facing the same shortages have less food to spare. Families postpone repairs to houses or tools because every available worker is needed at the canal. Nutritional stress weakens resistance to disease. Ordinary disagreements over water take on sharper consequences. The canal networks themselves may amplify the crisis. Large systems are efficient when flow is sufficient and labour is coordinated, but they are difficult to shrink. A main channel built to serve several villages cannot easily be maintained by one declining settlement. If downstream communities leave, upstream residents may question why they should clear miles of canal that no longer benefit as many people. If upstream villages fail to repair the intake, downstream households have little reason to maintain their branches. The shared system begins losing the cooperation that once made it resilient. Population movement follows, though it does not occur in one direction or at one moment. Some families may relocate within the same valley, moving from vulnerable outer branches toward more reliable land. Others join relatives in neighbouring settlements. Communities consolidate into larger compounds, perhaps seeking stronger labour pools, protection, or access to better managed canals. Some people leave the major river basins entirely, travelling toward areas where rainfall, springs, or smaller irrigation systems offer different possibilities. Archaeologists see houses abandoned, villages reorganised, and pottery traditions changing, but the motives behind each movement remain uncertain. The crisis may also intensify existing inequality. Families connected to powerful compounds or mound centres might secure water, storage, and labour more easily. Those with distant exchange partners may obtain food unavailable locally. Upstream communities possess physical advantages that custom alone may no longer overcome. If authorities attempt to enforce water allocations or labour demands during scarcity, their decisions can preserve cooperation or destroy it. A leader who distributes stored food gains legitimacy. One perceived as favouring relatives or retaining surplus may deepen resentment. Evidence of violence at some late sites has encouraged interpretations involving conflict, raiding, or social breakdown. Defensive locations, burned structures, and human remains bearing trauma suggest that violence occurred in parts of the region. Yet it would be misleading to portray the entire valley as collapsing into warfare. Many communities continued daily life, repaired canals, and adapted their settlements. Violence may have been one response among many, concentrated at particular times and places. Environmental stress can increase conflict, but it does not determine it automatically. Ritual changes may reflect the same uncertainty. When engineering fails to guarantee water, communities may intensify ceremonies directed toward rain, river flow, ancestors, or sacred places. Platform mound centres could gain importance if they promise coordination and stability. They could also lose authority if repeated ceremonies and labour demands fail to restore abundance. Religious and political institutions are strongest when they appear capable of maintaining order. A sequence of uncontrollable floods and droughts exposes the limits of that claim. The 14th century crisis therefore cannot be reduced to the weather alone. Flood and drought act upon a landscape already carrying large populations, aging canals, unequal access, and changing political institutions. The same environmental event has different effects depending on where a household lives, how much food it stores, and whether its neighbours continue cooperating. A modest shortage in a flexible community may produce adjustment. The same shortage in an overextended network can trigger abandonment. Across the valleys, the ancient builders continue to respond with skill. They recut channels, shift intakes, move villages, and change how land is used. But the rhythm of recovery is slowing. Each repair restores less certainty than the one before it. The river that once supported expansion now rearranges the foundations of the canal world. And when its flow retreats again, the empty channels begin to reveal how fragile a civilization of moving water can become. By the early 15th century, many of the largest canal settlements are changing or emptying, but there is no single moment when the entire system stops. One branch may continue carrying water while another lies dry. A mound centre may lose population even as a smaller village nearby remains occupied. Some canals are repaired, shortened, or redirected. Others fill slowly with sediment after maintenance ends. The transformation unfolds unevenly across the Salt and Gila valleys, which is one reason the disappearance of the Great Canal world has resisted simple explanation. Archaeology records the result more clearly than the process. Fewer large settlements, abandoned compounds, changing pottery traditions, altered burial practices, and irrigation networks no longer maintained at their former scale. For many years, explanations focused heavily on environmental disaster. Floods destroyed headworks, drought reduced river flow, salinity weakened fields. These pressures were real, and in certain places they may have been decisive. Yet people had endured floods and dry years for centuries. The canal builders possessed generations of experience in repairing damage, shifting fields, and surviving shortages. Climate alone cannot explain why resilience failed at this particular time. The deeper problem was that environmental stress struck a society already carrying other burdens. Population pressure is one possible factor. At the height of the irrigation system, the valleys supported large numbers of people concentrated along networks dependent on shared water. More households meant more labour for maintenance, but also more demand for crops, fuel, building materials, and land. Fields farther from the river required longer channels and lost more water through seepage and evaporation. Marginal land became worth cultivating because better plots were already claimed. During favourable years, expansion increased production. During poor years, it placed more families at risk. A dense population can also magnify disease. Settled villages bring people, refuse, stored grain, rodents, insects, and water into close contact. Irrigation creates damp places where parasites and mosquitoes may thrive. Food shortages weaken immunity, making ordinary infections more dangerous. Archaeologists can sometimes identify malnutrition, anemia, or infection in human remains, but evidence is incomplete and preservation varies greatly. No known epidemic can be shown to have swept through every canal community. Disease may nevertheless have contributed quietly, reducing labour forces and increasing mortality at the same time that canals demanded emergency repairs. Political fragmentation offers another layer. The mound centres and enclosed compounds suggest that authority had become more concentrated in some places. Such institutions may have coordinated labour and distributed food successfully for generations. During prolonged crisis, however, people may have questioned whether leaders still deserved obedience. If influential households claimed preferred water access, stored surplus, or demanded labour without providing security, cooperation could erode. A canal system cannot survive through engineering knowledge alone. It requires thousands of people to continue believing that the shared arrangement is fair enough to maintain. The architecture of hierarchy may therefore have become a liability. Enclosed compounds separated groups more clearly. Platform mounds elevated certain institutions above others. During abundance, those distinctions could organize ceremonies and work. During scarcity, they could sharpen resentment. Downstream farmers watching upstream fields remain green might no longer accept old water rules. Smaller settlements might resist contributing labour to centres that appeared to benefit disproportionately. Even a rumour of hidden stores or favoured households could damage trust when food was scarce. Social conflict may have followed, though its scale remains disputed. Some sites show burning, trauma, or defensive behaviour. Communities may have raided food stores, attacked rivals, or fought over canal access. Yet many abandoned settlements show no evidence of violent destruction. Walls can mark privacy or identity rather than warfare. Burned buildings may result from accidents or ritual closure. The record suggests episodes of conflict. Not a single invasion or region-wide war that erased the canal civilization. Popular theories sometimes imagine foreign conquerors sweeping into the valleys, but there is little evidence for a sudden replacement of the population by an invading army. Changes in pottery and architecture once attributed to outsiders are now more often understood as signs of migration, intermarriage, shifting alliances, and cultural transformation involving both local and incoming groups. People from neighbouring regions may have entered the valleys during this period. Just as canal residents were leaving for other places, movement was complex and multi-directional. Migration itself was probably not merely the final consequence of collapse. It may have been one of the strategies that allowed people to survive. Families could leave a failing branch and join relatives elsewhere. Skilled farmers might move towards smaller rivers, springs, or rainfall-dependent communities. Marriage ties and trade relationships provided routes into new settlements. A village could divide, with some households remaining while others departed. Over time, These decisions reduced the labour available to maintain the largest canals, making further departures more likely. This creates a feedback loop. Environmental damage lowers harvests. Poor harvests increase tension and weaken health. Some families leave. Their departure reduces the workforce available for canal repair. Less maintenance delivers less water, harming more fields. Leaders attempt to reorganize labour or impose stricter rules, which may deepen political resistance. Conflict disrupts trade and food sharing. Each pressure strengthens the others until a network that had survived individual crises can no longer recover from their combination. The regional exchange system may also have weakened. Bald courts had already declined, and the older pattern of open gatherings had changed. If trade routes became less dependable, communities lost access to food, raw materials, and distant allies during shortages. Cotton and shell ornaments mattered culturally, but exchange networks also carried information and relationships. Their contraction could make settlements more isolated precisely when outside support was most valuable. Changes in beliefs and ritual institutions may have accompanied this fragmentation. Ceremonies that once united several villages could lose credibility if water failed repeatedly. Different communities might adopt new practices or strengthen ties with neighbouring cultural traditions. The abandonment of mound centres may reflect not only population decline, but rejection of the authority those places represented. What looks archaeologically like disappearance may include deliberate social reorganisation, as people left behind institutions that no longer served them. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation because no single community experienced it in the same way. One village may have been struck by flood damage, another by declining soil, another by political conflict, and another by the loss of upstream cooperation. Some places may have emptied quickly, others endured for decades at reduced scale. The word collapse can imply a sudden fall, but the canal world more likely unravelled strand by strand. The greatest mistake is to imagine that the people simply failed to understand their environment. They understood it extraordinarily well. Their canals had worked for centuries. What changed was the relationship between environmental uncertainty and social capacity. A society can manage drought if cooperation remains strong. It can survive political disputes if harvests remain abundant. It can recover from flood if labour and stored food are available. When all of these supports weaken together, even highly skilled communities face limits. The great canals did not end because their builders forgot how to move water. They ended because keeping water moving no longer solved every problem surrounding it. The channels depended on villages, the villages depended on trust, and trust depended on institutions that could survive scarcity. Once those connections began to break, the canal system ceased to be a source of unity and became a measure of how much unity had already been lost. When the largest canals fall out of use and the great settlements lose population, the archaeological landscape becomes quieter. Houses collapse, roof beams decay. Wind carries dust into courtyards. Sediment fills the channels, softening their banks until they resemble natural depressions. To later outsiders, this silence suggests disappearance. Ruins appear where villages once stood. And the absence of monumental stone cities makes it easy to imagine that an entire people simply vanished into the desert. That image has shaped popular accounts for generations, but it is deeply misleading. The canal world changed, its institutions fragmented, and many settlements were abandoned. Yet the people themselves did not dissolve from history. The word Hohokam has often reinforced the impression of a vanished population. It is an archaeological label, not the known name of a single ancient nation. The term entered academic use through the Ogham language and has commonly been interpreted in relation to those who are gone or finished. Though translations and meanings require care, archaeologists used it to organize pottery styles, architecture, burial customs, and settlement patterns across a long period. The label became useful for classification, but it could also make the ancient farmers appear separate from indigenous peoples living in the region today. Many Hohokam people understand the canal builders as ancestors rather than strangers. Their histories connect present communities with the valleys, mountains, rivers, sacred places, and ancient settlements of the Sonoran Desert. These traditions do not always match the categories created by archaeology, nor should they be expected to. Archaeological culture names group objects and practices that researchers can observe. Indigenous histories preserve relationships, movements, responsibilities. and identities that may not leave simple material traces. The two forms of knowledge ask different questions, and tension arises when one is treated as automatically superior to the other. The Hohokam are not a single undifferentiated community. Akimel Hohokam, often translated as river people, have long maintained strong connections to the Gila River and irrigated agriculture. Tohono Hohokam, or desert people, developed lifeways adapted to broad desert territories and seasonal water sources. Other related communities, including the harshest Hohokam, hold histories tied to different parts of the Sonoran landscape. Modern political boundaries and tribal designations do not perfectly reproduce the social world of the distant past, but they demonstrate that indigenous life continued across the region after the decline of the largest prehistoric settlements. Continuity does not require every family to remain beside the same canal. The crisis of the 14th and 15th centuries likely caused movement in many directions. Some groups relocated within the river valleys. Others joined communities in surrounding deserts, uplands, or neighbouring regions. Families merged, separated, formed new alliances, and adopted different ways of farming. A large village could disappear archaeologically, even while its former residents continued living a few days' journey away. The abandonment of architecture is not the extinction of a population. This distinction matters because migration is often mistaken for failure. For people facing damaged canals, political conflict, or unreliable harvests, leaving may have been a rational and successful choice. A household that remained committed to an unworkable branch could lose everything. One that moved toward relatives, springs, smaller irrigation works, or more flexible farming zones might preserve lives, knowledge, and social connections. The ancient canal system became smaller, but its people adapted beyond it. Archaeology offers several clues to this continuity. Later communities continued forms of irrigation farming in parts of the region, technologies of pottery, food preparation, house construction, basketry, and desert resource use show both change and persistence. Settlement patterns shift rather than ending completely. Materials and practices associated with neighbouring peoples appear alongside local traditions, suggesting interaction and integration instead of simple replacement. Human populations do not fit neatly into the rise and fall outlines used to describe archaeological periods. Language provides another layer, though it cannot draw a straight line from every ancient village to a specific modern community. Hohokam languages belong to the Uto-Aztecan language family, which extends across a large portion of western North America and Mexico. Linguistic relationships reveal deep histories of movement and connection, but languages change, spread, and merge in ways that are difficult to date precisely. Scholars still debate how linguistic, archaeological, and biological evidence should be combined. No single line of evidence can reconstruct every migration or family history. Oral traditions preserve accounts of creation, conflict, movement, flood, settlement, and relationships with earlier beings or ancestral groups. These narratives may contain layers shaped across many generations. They should not be treated as coded archaeological reports whose purpose is to provide modern researchers with dates and site names. Their significance lies partly in how they define obligations to land and ancestors. A ruined mound may not be an abandoned object available for unrestricted study. It can remain a place of presence, memory, and spiritual consequence. This difference in perspective has practical effects. Archaeologists once excavated indigenous burials and ceremonial objects with little consultation, treating human remains as scientific specimens and sacred materials as museum property. Descendant communities have challenged those practices, demanding greater authority over ancestral places and the return of remains and cultural items. Modern research increasingly involves consultation, tribal historic preservation offices, collaborative interpretation, and respect for sites that communities may prefer not to excavate or publicly identify. Even the question of what to call the canal builders has changed. Some researchers continue using Hohokam because it remains widely recognized and useful within archaeological literature. Others prefer ancestral Dum or ancestral Sonoran desert people, especially when emphasizing continuity and avoiding the idea of an extinct culture. No term is perfect. Ancestral Hohokam may express important living connections, but ancient populations were likely diverse and may also have contributed to the histories of other indigenous peoples. The evidence suggests migration and interaction across the southwest, making exclusive claims difficult to prove. The canal builders may have joined or influenced communities associated with the ancestors of Pueblo peoples, human-speaking peoples, and groups farther south. Pottery styles, architectural practices, and ritual traditions crossed regional boundaries. Some people entering the valleys may also have become part of later Hohokam communities. The human story is one of mixing rather than sealed cultural containers moving across a map. European colonization later transformed this continuity through violence, disease, missionary activity, land seizure, and the diversion of water. Spanish expeditions and missions imposed new political and religious systems, but indigenous communities persisted. During the 19th and 20th centuries, expanding American settlement and upstream irrigation severely reduced river flows relied upon by Acumel Hohokam farmers. Fields that had been productive through generations dried as water was taken elsewhere. Hunger and economic disruption followed, turning an ancient tradition of river agriculture into another struggle over access and control. This later history gives the buried canals a sharper meaning. They are not relics of a mysterious race whose skills vanished. They stand within a continuing story of indigenous engineering and water rights. Modern Hohokam communities have pursued restoration, cultural preservation, and legal recognition while maintaining traditions adapted to landscapes altered by dams, cities, borders, and industrial agriculture. Their survival challenges the habit of ending indigenous history whenever an archaeological period changes its name. What disappears around the 15th century is a particular configuration of large canal networks, mound-centered settlements, and regional institutions. The people reorganize, their descendants endure. Some ancestral identities continue directly, others through complex combinations that archaeology cannot fully trace. The evidence remains incomplete, but it does not support the image of a population vanishing without consequence or connection. The dry channels beneath Arizona therefore do not lead only backward. They lead toward living communities whose histories were often excluded from the stories told about the ruins. Once that continuity is recognized, the mystery changes. The question is no longer where the canal builders went, as though they stepped outside history. It becomes how their descendants preserved identity, memory, and environmental knowledge through centuries of movement, colonization, and repeated struggles over the same precious water. Centuries after the largest ancient canal networks fell silent, their lines still shaped the valley. Sediment filled the channels, vegetation spread across their banks, and floods softened their edges. But the desert did not erase them completely. Some survived as shallow depressions visible from a distance. Others remained as long ridges formed from soil removed during generations of cleaning. Even where the surface appeared level, buried layers preserved the outlines of older waterways. The canals had become part of the land, almost natural in appearance, though every curve recorded deliberate human judgment. When newcomers entered the Salt River Valley during the 19th century, they encountered these traces without always understanding who had created them. Surveyors, farmers, soldiers, and settlers described abandoned canals extending across ground that seemed otherwise empty. The channels contradicted the belief that the valley had never supported a substantial population. Their size suggested extensive fields, organized labor, and communities capable of maintaining complex irrigation long before American settlement. Yet many newcomers interpreted the ruins through the language of disappearance. They imagined a vanished race rather than acknowledging the ancestors of indigenous peoples still living throughout the region. The old routes also offered an immediate practical advantage. Settlers searching for ways to irrigate the valley recognized that ancient builders had already solved the hardest surveying problem. The abandoned channels followed gradients tested across centuries. Reopening one could be easier than designing a completely new route. Modern ditches were therefore cut along, beside, or directly through ancient canals. The new builders enlarged old trenches, altered intakes, and connected them to changing agricultural settlements. In doing so, they relied on knowledge written into the earth while often giving little credit to the people who had placed it there. Phoenix emerged from this landscape of reuse. Its name carried the image of a city rising from the remains of an earlier civilization, but the metaphor concealed as much as it revealed. The ancient world beneath the new settlement was not merely a bed of ashes. Indigenous communities had not vanished. and the water systems had not failed because the land was destined to wait for modern engineering. The 19th century city inherited roots, fields, and possibilities created through thousands of years of adaptation. It also grew within a colonial system that transferred land and water away from native communities. As Phoenix expanded, many archaeological remains disappeared beneath construction. Roads cut across villages, houses covered fields, industrial sites occupied canal alignments, gravel extraction, agriculture, and flood control projects disturbed deposits before they could be studied. Early archaeologists recorded some sites, but countless others were lost with little documentation. The modern city became both a monument to the ancient irrigation landscape and the main force concealing it. Occasionally, development exposes what lies below. A trench opened for a pipeline reveals a broad canal filled with layered sediment. Construction workers encounter pottery, stone tools, house floors, or human burials. Archaeologists are called to document the features before work continues. These excavations often take place within narrow corridors and strict deadlines, offering only fragments of a much larger settlement. One canal wall may appear on one side of a road, while its continuation lies beneath buildings that cannot be disturbed. From these fragments, researchers reconstruct the hidden map. Soil color reveals where water once flowed, sediment layers show periods of cleaning, abandonment, flooding, and reuse. Changes in channel width suggest expansion or declining demand. Pottery from nearby deposits helps estimate when particular sections were active. A canal that appears to be one feature may contain the remains of several channels, cut one inside another, each representing a different generation's response to the river. Modern technology allows researchers to examine these traces in ways earlier investigators could not. Aerial photography preserves canal alignments visible before urban growth covered them. Geographic information systems combine old maps, excavation reports, elevation data, and settlement locations. Remote sensing can reveal subtle surface patterns, though pavement and buildings limit what can be detected in the city. Computer models estimate how water may have moved through particular networks and how much land they could have irrigated. These methods sharpen the picture, but they do not remove uncertainty. Many canals were destroyed before they were mapped, and the social rules governing them cannot be recovered from their dimensions alone. The contrast between ancient and modern water systems is striking. The canal builders worked with seasonal rivers, temporary diversions, earthen channels, and communal labor. Modern Arizona relies on massive dams, reservoirs, pumping stations, concrete canals, groundwater wells, and water transported across long distances. Electricity moves water where gravity alone cannot. Cities consume it far beyond the ancient agricultural corridors. Yet the underlying problem remains familiar. How to support a large population in a desert where supply is variable and demand can exceed what rivers reliably provide. The ancient system offers no simple blueprint for the modern metropolis. Its population, technology, crops, and political institutions were different. Romantic claims that the old canals were perfectly sustainable ignore salinity, conflict, flood damage, and eventual contraction. The builders did not possess a flawless relationship with nature. They experimented, expanded, made mistakes, repaired damage, and sometimes abandoned land that no longer worked. Their achievement becomes more meaningful, not less, when its limits are acknowledged. What they demonstrate is that infrastructure is always social. A canal functions only when people agree to maintain it, distribute its benefits, and accept restrictions during scarcity. Engineering can carry water across the desert, but it cannot decide what fairness means. Dams can store a river, but they cannot remove conflict between cities, farms, industries, ecosystems, and indigenous nations. Greater technical power may delay difficult decisions, yet it can also enlarge the number of people dependent on a system whose limits remain real. The ancient valleys show how abundance can create vulnerability. Irrigation supports population growth, specialized labor, ceremonies, exchange, and political complexity. Each success encourages further expansion. Fields spread farther from the river. Communities rely more deeply on shared infrastructure. Eventually, the cost of maintaining the system rises while environmental margins narrow. The canal world does not collapse because irrigation is a mistake. It becomes fragile because irrigation succeeds so completely that nearly every part of society comes to depend on it. Modern Phoenix carries a similar contradiction on a far larger scale. Lawns, swimming pools, factories, farms, cooling systems, and millions of residents occupy a region still governed by heat and limited water. The rivers have been reshaped, but drought has not disappeared. Groundwater can be pumped, but not indefinitely without consequence. Water can be transferred from distant basins, but those sources face their own competing demands. The desert continues to impose limits even when technology makes them temporarily difficult to see. Beneath the city, the ancient canals remain quiet evidence that this challenge is not new. Their builders transformed the valley without ever gaining complete control over it. They understood gradients that could barely be seen, organized labor across several villages, and kept water moving for centuries. They also lived through floods, droughts, inequality, political change, and the eventual unraveling of networks too complex to survive every pressure at once. The desert remembers both parts of that story. It remembers ingenuity in the lines that still guide modern canals. It remembers vulnerability in the channels that ended beneath layers of silt. And it remembers the people themselves through Hohokam communities whose relationship with the land continues beyond the artificial boundary between ancient history and the present. The evening light settles slowly over the Salt River Valley, turning mountains violet at the edges and laying long shadows across the modern grid. From above, the city appears complete, a vast geometry of roads, houses, lights, and cultivated land. Nothing in that view immediately reveals the older pattern beneath it. Yet under foundations and parking lots, the canal lines continue. They pass below places where no water has flowed for centuries, following gradients measured by people whose names are no longer known. The river they depended upon has changed. Dams hold back its floods, concrete directs portions of its flow. In many seasons, the broad channel through Phoenix appears nearly dry, but the mountains still gather storms, sediment still moves, and desert heat still pulls moisture from every exposed surface. The forces faced by the ancient farmers have not vanished. They have merely been reorganized behind machines, laws, reservoirs, and walls. Time softens the edges of every civilization. Houses become stains in the soil. Public spaces lose their voices. A canal that once determined whether families ate becomes a pale band discovered beneath a construction trench. Yet usefulness can outlive memory. Long after its builders are forgotten by those who arrive later, their chosen route continues carrying water. Their calculations survive because gravity has not changed. There is something humbling in that endurance. The canal builders created no permanent victory over the desert. They made a long agreement with it, renewed through labor season after season. For centuries, the agreement held. When conditions shifted and cooperation weakened, the landscape changed again. Villages emptied, water withdrew, and the desert folded their work into itself without entirely erasing it. Their story does not end in emptiness. It continues in descendants, in restored histories, in disputes over water, and in every excavation that reveals another hidden channel. It continues whenever the modern city confronts the same old question beneath newer language: how many lives can depend upon a river before dependence becomes danger? Night reaches the valley gradually. Traffic moves above the buried waterways, and lights spread across fields that once followed ancient branches. Far below, the silent canals remain aligned with the faint descent of the earth. They wait without mystery or motion, preserving the shape of water that passed through them and the memory of hands that taught a desert river to travel.